Hello to our wonderful audience and good morning, everyone. I'm Professor Jackie Peel of the Melbourne Law School and the Director of Melbourne Climate Futures. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our launch event, Climate 2021. In a moment, we'll be getting to our opening panel event, but in the meantime, it's my great pleasure to introduce Auntie Georgina Nicholson, an elder of the Wurundjeri people who will be welcoming us to country. Auntie Georgina will be followed by our Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, Professor Duncan Maskell, and by our Acting Provost, Professor Jim McCluskey. Thank you, Auntie Georgina.
Thank you, Jackie. Hello, everyone. My name is Georgina Nicholson, and I am a proud Wurundjeri Woiwurrung woman. Wurundjeri being part of the Kulin Nation. The Kulin Nation consists of 5 clans, and they are Wurundjeri, Boonwurrung, Wathaurong, Tunurong, and Dja-Dja-Wurrung. Wurundjeri being all of Melbourne CBD and surrounding country, extending north to the Great Dividing Range, east to Mount Baw Baw, south to Mordialloc Creek, and west to the mouth of Werribee River. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to our ancestors who walked and lived on this land as free spirits for millennia. I would also like to pay my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be online with us today, and I would like to pay my respect to your elders. I would also like to acknowledge Professor Jacqueline Peel, Jackie, Vice-Chancellor Professor Duncan Maskell, sorry if I've pronounced it wrong, and Professor Jim McCluskey, and other dignitaries that I may not be able to mention because I haven't got it written down here. But I am pleased to be doing the welcome today for Melbourne Uni for this very important event about climate futures and everything. So, yeah, I'm going to stay online after my welcome and listen. For those of you tuning in from Wurundjeri country, I would like to say to you, Womanjika Wurundjeri Balak, Yemen Kundibik. So I would just like to tell you what I've said in our Woiwurrung language, and that is welcome to the land of the Wurundjeri people. For people that are joining us from locations across Victoria, Australia, and perhaps beyond, I'm not sure, I would like to welcome you all also and pay my respect to all of you and your elders. So as we navigate our way through the COVID-19 pandemic, I reflect on the legacy of those who have come before me, and I do draw strength from them. I come from a very long, unbroken, strong line of Aboriginal women. I think about the challenges they faced. So my mother, Martha Margaret Nicholson née Terrick, was delivered by her grandmother, Granny Jemima, and that was on Corranderk Aboriginal Mission near the present-day town of Healesville. So our mother was already learning the importance of family, culture and connection to country. Years later, our mother met a deadly Irish man called Patrick, and they met on a blind date in Melbourne in the early 1930s. In 1937, Mummy and Daddy were married, and back then it was in a registry office, and they had 16 children, 8 girls, 8 boys, and all single babies. No twins, so no cheating. LOL. I'm the youngest of the 16, and the oldest is my sister, Pat Ockwell. Pat Ockwell is an amazing senior elder, for she turned 83 last year, and for an Indigenous woman to reach that age is a milestone. She has made a lifelong commitment to her community and her peoples. I don't know if you've heard of William Barrett, but if you have, his younger sister, Annie Barrett, is my direct bloodline. You can always go on Google and look him up. So one tradition being our Woiwurrung language. It's a part of our deep heritage, rich deep heritage. Our language has been sleeping, but I like to say we are now waking it up. Some of the ways we keep it alive is through song, dance and performance. The coronavirus pandemic has changed the world in ways we would never have imagined. The implications for our community have been profound for our health, our well-being and our jobs. But perhaps online events like this, we're able to still connect as people and community, which is great to have this. I don't know what we would have done without it. So yes, I just want to say that for people that are in other states and maybe other countries, if they're online, my heart goes out to you all. Victoria went through a tough time with the lockdowns. We're all good now. If everybody does what they're told to do, I believe we will come out of this. But it's still lurking around, so we have to be careful. So Aboriginal culture is the oldest living culture there is. It dates back to 80,000 years plus. So it's a long time, isn't it? Aboriginal people do know about resilience, solidarity and connection to land. Up to date, there have been no treaties with us and we have never ceded our sovereignty. So Wurundjeri people would like to ask you to respect the land and the waters, the flora and fauna, and most importantly, respect each other, and please take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to the launch of Melbourne Climate Futures. I begin, of course, by thanking Auntie Georgina Nicholson for her generous words of welcome to country. And I will also take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which the university stands. The various campuses of our university stand on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, the Boonwurrung people, the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and the Yorta Yorta people. I pay my respects to Auntie Georgina and to all the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. And I acknowledge all Indigenous people who are watching this launch today. This morning's initiative is, I think, a very important contribution to perhaps the most pressing issue facing the world today. Living through a global pandemic for over a year, as we've all just done, has highlighted many things in a new way. And among them, I think, is the critical importance of the expert voice in shaping and influencing public policy at times of pressing need in the world. This is one of those times, particularly on the climate front, with increasing concerns over extreme weather events around the world, including, of course, Australia. And we're seeing, we mustn't confuse individual weather events with climate change. But of course, I think the Sydney floods are yet another extreme event that we're seeing right now. And of course, the increasing need for governments to agree on actions that can help the world adapt to climate change is a matter of urgency. It was urgent quite a long time ago, and it's still urgent, and not a lot's happened. I think it can't be more evident than it is right now that knowledge, research, and education are absolutely vital in tackling these massive problems. I'm a scientist, and I've worked in several countries, and I strongly believe in the great role that can be played by top universities in bringing together experts who have deep knowledge and a commitment to translating that knowledge in useful ways. Indeed, I think that the convening power of universities is one of our most important strengths. And here at the University of Melbourne, we have a critical role to play, bringing together experts from many disciplines and many different places. And I think a great example of this is the initiative that we launched today, Melbourne Climate Futures. This project is closely aligned with the university's Advancing Melbourne strategy, which itself was launched just last year amid the challenges of the pandemic. As part of our strategic approach, we're aiming to create new centres of excellence which will become leaders in reach, ambition and impact. And we believe Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative will achieve this in helping to tackle climate change in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. This really exciting initiative can be a really important platform for university researchers in several different disciplines to lead and to influence emerging public conversations on the future of climate policy. I hope that everyone can take a lot from today's event and that you all enjoy engaging with the wonderful people we have across this institution involved in this area. So thank you to everyone for joining. And it is now my great pleasure to call on the Acting Provost of the University of Melbourne, Professor Jim McCluskey, who will officially launch the initiative. Over to you, Jim.
Well, thank you, Vice-Chancellor. What a great privilege it is to launch this today. Auntie Georgina, thank you for your welcome. Earlier this month, the US climate change envoy, John Kerry, told the world that now is the moment. Glasgow, where the UN Climate Change Conference will be held in November, is the last best opportunity that we have and the best hope that the world will come together and build on Paris. This decade, he said, 2020 to 2030 must be the decade of action. Anyone who doesn't recognise that must seriously not be taking notice. Our Vice-Chancellor has outlined why higher education has to play a key role in this, and the University of Melbourne, I think, has a particular role. The Melbourne Climate Future Initiative is our particular contribution to this global push. The initiative doesn't come out of isolation. It builds on decades of research in areas such as climate change impact in the Pacific, energy futures, and bushfire resilience. In essence, what Jackie Peel will be doing is bringing together a network of networks. So these are not siloed efforts. The initiative accelerates and amplifies stuff we've already been doing in the area of interdisciplinary climate research and research endeavour. And you just have to look at the agenda to see that diversity. We have colleagues from a range of our institutes and partner organisations and research centres, such as the Climate Energy College, the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, the Centre for Health and Equity and the Connected Cities Lab, and many other researchers who are involved in our collective effort in the Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative. Among those are those from the social sciences and those from the physical and mathematical sciences, such as the Energy Institute, led by Michael Breer. And importantly, we're supported by the Melbourne Indigenous Knowledges Institute, and we have such a lot to learn from our Indigenous scholars and colleagues. The Climate Futures Initiative will help us convene stakeholders in a collaborative partnership, and there are two key words here, collaborative and partnership. This is the essence of what Jackie will be leading. Importantly, there's a very strong social science lens here, and I think some of the issues that the Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative will make front and centre include policy opportunities that can really change our society, the economic opportunity, which I'm sure Ross Garnaut will emphasise, and the importance of our regional neighbours in Asia and Southeast Asia. So collaboration and partnership, where research leads on the future of our planet. Indeed, I think probably not just the planet, but actually humanity. The planet may well look after itself long after we're gone. So I congratulate Professor Jacqueline Peel and her team on this fantastic, creative and exciting endeavour. Jackie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jim, for those remarks, and also to our VC, Duncan Maskell, previously. And I'd also like to add my thanks to Auntie Georgina for her very warm welcome to country and her reminder as we broadcast this event today from Wurundjeri country that we have an obligation to respect and care for that country. I know our audience will be keen to get underway for the main programming of the day, but I just wanted to say a few brief remarks myself to add my own welcome to you and to explain why we see Melbourne Climate Futures as being such an important initiative to be launching and to be launching at this time. 2021 is shaping up to be a critical year for action and ambition on climate change. We've seen with the Biden administration coming into power in the US, the shifts that are taking place in domestic policy there, and also the increasing international momentum for action on climate change. In our own region, some of Australia's major trading partners, including China, South Korea and Japan, are making announcements about moving towards net zero emissions by 2050 or 2060 in the case of China. This is pushing the Australian government to do more, and we're already seeing some small steps, such as the Prime Minister expressing a preference for Australia to move towards net zero emissions by 2050. But it's clear that much more needs to be done. And there are the chance for further shifts this year, particularly as countries convene at the end of the year in Glasgow for the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, COP26. If 2020 was the year of the COVID crisis, as Auntie Georgina talked about, the year of lockdowns, and also online teaching and schooling, 2021 potentially promises to be the year of climate ambition. And as we emerge from the COVID crisis and start to think about how we reshape our economy and safeguard ourselves against future pandemic risk, we have a chance to shape the future and to shape it in ways that will ensure that we build resilience for the climate crisis and put in place solutions to drive a better future. As our Vice-Chancellor Duncan Maskell and Professor McCluskey have highlighted, the launch of Melbourne Climate Futures in such a critical year is a shared initiative and one designed to emphasise the importance of the expert voice and to amplify our research inputs ahead of important international events like the Glasgow COP26. It's also a call to action for our academics and our students, but also our industry, government, and media and philanthropic partners to identify key issues and actions for change to build a sustainable climate future. While we want Melbourne Climate Futures to lead and contribute to the global challenge of climate change, we remain deeply connected to our place, NARM, the City of Melbourne, our regional communities in Victoria, and our own and future communities of students and early career researchers at the University of Melbourne. A commitment to place and to country in shaping a sustainable climate future highlights the central role of Indigenous peoples, including the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the lands on which the University of Melbourne's campuses primarily sit, and the First Nations peoples of Victoria and Australia. Melbourne Climate Futures will seek to work closely with Indigenous communities, recognising that relationship needs to be equitable, respectful of people's time and many other commitments to community, and based on trust and tangible benefits for Indigenous peoples. I'm already very deeply grateful for the generosity that Indigenous colleagues at Melbourne and elsewhere have shown us in guiding us on how best to approach this relationship and helping shape events and projects for the future focused on protecting and healing country together as a vital component of addressing climate change. Today is just the start of a long-term vision for this project, and we've designed the day to reflect this. We'll start this morning with a review of the current landscape and what's required to drive further change. Then we're going to switch to looking at the challenges we face, particularly in building resilient communities and landscapes. Before we end on a positive and a hopeful note, I think so important as we face our climate change future, we have a great panel who will discuss developing effective solutions. There's also a lunchtime session for students and early career researchers, and indeed anyone young at heart who's interested in doing more on climate, to talk about the career pathways that exist in climate-related disciplines. I'm delighted that so many of our different communities connected with Melbourne were able to share your time with us today to take part in and attend and participate in this event. And we look forward to continuing to engage with you on building a sustainable climate future. But now it's my very great pleasure on no less than World Meteorological Day to be handing over to the fabulous Nate Byrne, the ABC News breakfast weather presenter, who will be moderating our very first panel for the day, Climate 2021, Driving the Change.
Thanks, Jackie. 2021 is bringing the promise of a step change for policy and action on climate change. We faced the horrific bushfires of the Australian summer of 2020. We've seen the inauguration of pro-climate President Biden in the United States. China's now aiming to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. We've got calls for a green recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, and there's growing pressure on the Australian government to commit to strong emissions reduction targets. Now, later this year in November, countries will gather in Glasgow for COP26, the 26th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, addressing world leaders in the lead-up to COP26, has urged we cannot let climate action become another victim of coronavirus. Let us be the leaders who secure the very health of the planet for our children, grandchildren, and generations to come. This panel brings together leading experts and thought leaders from a range of diverse areas: economics, politics, geography, and urban planning, to debate and discuss their hopes and expectations for 2021. And now I would love to introduce you to our speakers, starting with the people we've got live in the studio. Dr. Kate Dooley. Kate is a research fellow at the Climate and Energy College. We're also joined by Professor John Barnett from the University of Melbourne School of Geography and Laureate fellow and lead researcher on the Future Islands project. Finally, live in the studio, Dr. Kathy Oak, Enterprise Senior Fellow in Informed Cities from the Connected Cities Lab. Joining us remotely, Professor Robyn Eckersley from the University of Melbourne School of Social and Political Sciences. She's the author of The Green State, Rethinking Democracy and Sovereignty. And finally, he needs no real introduction, I think, Professor Ross Garnaut AO, of course, an economist and author of Reset, Restoring Australia After the Great Clash of 2020. Good morning. Welcome to you all. I think the first question I will kick off with is, considering your own field, what is the one most critical thing we should be thinking about when it comes to climate in 2021? And Ross, I'd like to start with you.
This year is shaping up as a great opportunity to deal with the climate change while we deal with the economic aftermath of the pandemic. We've got a large challenge of restoring full employment or achieving full employment. We haven't had full employment for a very long time. And following that with incomes growth. Many of the paths to growth that we've used in the past are being blocked. There won't be strong growth in fossil energy exports. In fact, there'll be decline through the 2020s. The universities are not in strong shape to have strong growth in exports of education services. The impediments in the relationship with China will block other areas of growth. But a great new opportunity has opened with President Biden's election. Now, every other developed country in the world and China are committed to zero emissions by around the middle of the century. Australia is the best placed country in the world to make use of that opportunity by investing in zero emissions goods production, processing our minerals using energy made from renewable energy. We have this opportunity because we have the richest renewable energy resources in the world and the greatest opportunity to grow and store carbon in our landscape. It would be a failure of immense dimension affecting our economic future as well as our climate future if we failed to make use of this opportunity.
It is certainly a significant one. Robyn, what are your thoughts? What should we really be focusing on this year?
Well, I think, as many people have already pointed out, this is an absolutely critical decade to meet a civilizational challenge. So really what we need to see is all hands on deck on every conceivable front. That's the only way we can beat this challenge. COP26 in Glasgow is really critical because last year was the year where all parties were supposed to update and enhance their emissions. But of course that didn't happen because of COVID. So everything's been postponed. So we're now hoping that there's going to be at the moment there's already a galvanization process underway diplomatically, not only by the COP presidency, the UK, but also of course John Kerry, Biden's new special climate envoy. So I guess the really crucial thing is about relations with US and China, because their cooperation was crucial to the success of the Paris Agreement. So what we have now is a new US administration that wants to lead far more aggressively than the Obama administration at home and abroad. But we see, we just saw in Alaska only a few days ago, incredibly strained relations between the US-China and quite strident exchanges. Although it's possible that climate diplomacy may be the one safe, productive channel for US climate relations. And one of the reasons for that is that they've brought back from semi-retirement China's seasoned diplomat, Xi Zhenhua, who worked with Kerry. He's been a diplomat from 2007 to 2018. So there's two folk who've been working together productively for a long time. So I grasp at that particular straw, hoping that there'll be a more productive cooperation and renewed from what we saw during the Trump administration. And I focus on the US and China because together they're responsible for around 40% of global emissions. So they are the E2, the biggest emitters. And that's where we need to watch if we really want to see action.
Cooperation is going to be absolutely crucial. And that's something I know, Kathy, that you think about in your work. 2021, what should we be focusing on?
Well, I might be biased as a former city councillor of 12 years, but cities, really are critical. And when we're looking at the national determined commitments that Robyn just mentioned, need to be updated and certainly accelerated this year. Cities must be recognised, not only for the impact that they have. There's, I think it's 70% of the world's greenhouse gases are emitted from cities. They consume 60% of the energy, and over 50% of the world population live in cities. So it's critical that national governments are working with their colleagues or the other levels of government at local and subnational level. So cities and regions are really critical. One of the best things is there is optimism in cities, because where nations have sometimes been lacking, cities have certainly been leading on the global stage. And we saw that in Paris with hundreds of mayors, with Mayor Hilgard from Paris leading, this amazing movement of cities signing up and committing to action on climate change. And we, just within the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, there's over 10,000 cities globally that have made a really strong commitment and action on climate change. And importantly, from a national perspective, is that you can actually accelerate and make your ambition really much higher, because cities are there to help, and resourcing cities to meet their climate ambition is really critical. And there's a real role for research and innovation in that, in helping cities meet their ambition by providing really excellent evidence for their decisions and resources around capacity and technology. So it's not just about finance, it's actually capacity around knowledge and innovation that cities need.
While cities have been taking action and some nations haven't, despite some of the biggest ones being obviously combined the biggest contributors, John, your area of expertise focuses on some of the people who are most hurt by where we already are with climate change. So what should we be focusing on this year?
Yeah, thanks, Nate. I think thinking about low-lying islands, it is important that we recognise we must reduce emissions, because the more we reduce emissions, the more time and space there is for those islands to adapt. The second thing I think that's really critical is we need to create hope for the future of these places. There is no hope in the current narrative about these places because we've failed to support them to adapt to climate change. The task is critical. The task is not trivial, and I think we need to be really investing in an adaptation moonshot for small islands. And there's all sorts of bases of social and ecological resilience. People have been living in these dynamic islands for 3,000 years. They know something about working with their environments, they know something about living with environments, and they have social institutions that make them resilient. The best applications of science and the best applications of modern technology, doing all the things we know that can promote rural resilience and sustainability, all the engineering solutions we know that work in places like Singapore and Hong Kong, investing very heavily in the future of these islands will enable most people in those islands to live on them. But we really have to step up and critically invest in an adaptation moonshot in those places to give those people hope. We all have commitments under the Charter of Human Rights to protect the human rights of people around the world. There are 4 low-lying atoll countries in the world whose human rights are at risk from climate change. We should be doing everything we can to protect those rights to enable them to adapt to climate change. And that's going to require a lot more effort from the international community and from research to make sure that they can.
Talking of research, Kate, your expertise on terrestrial climate accounting, what do you think we need to be focusing on this year? Maybe even more desperately now than ever before?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing at the moment this year is an increasing focus on achieving net zero by 2050. And any country or company who announces a net zero target is seen as a climate champion. But it's really important that we don't let these sort of vague long-term targets undermine immediate action. Emissions really need to go down in the next 5 and 10 years, so we need strong 25 and 2030 targets. And one of the risks with net zero as a target or an accounting framework is that it enables the fact that trees and forests soak up carbon dioxide. If we account for this under a net accounting framework, then we focus too much on terrestrial carbon emissions and soaking up carbon and not enough on actually reducing emissions and stop burning fossil fuels, which is what is really the most critical action that we need to be focusing on right now. That said, though, it's important that we realise that natural ecosystems store huge amounts of carbon, more carbon in the biosphere than in known reserves of fossil fuels. And there are also obviously natural ecosystems is where our biodiversity is and our life support systems for humanity and for living on the planet. So as well as the climate crisis, we're facing a biodiversity crisis. And 2021 is a really critical year, both because we've got the COP26 in Glasgow looking at climate change, but we've also got the 15th COP of the Convention on Biodiversity in China in October. And at that meeting, the focus is on setting 2030 biodiversity goals. And we need to look at these two things in a synergistic, integrated way. Both climate change and biodiversity need to be addressed together with policies that ensure one, action in climate change, for example, doesn't undermine biodiversity and vice versa.
Yeah, the biodiversity situation, certainly here in Australia, has been under threat in an incredible way over the last 12 months or more that we've probably never actually recorded before. So really important times for us to be focusing on that. And focusing we are at the moment. Yesterday, if anyone was watching the news, protesters were laying here in the city of Melbourne, outside of Parliament House, with the Climate Extinction Rebellion, protesting essentially Australia's inaction on climate change. Kathy, I want to speak to you as a former councillor. Where are we? Does this need to be driven by people? Is the government really letting us down? What needs to change now?
It's interesting you asked that question. I was reading the news and then I immediately started reading the next chapter in Greta Thunberg's biography, or unauthorised biography, for my daughter. She's 7. And, you know, she made such a change as one individual, you know, with her protest outside the Swedish Parliament, you know, and then obviously that's gathered an amazing momentum, particularly from young people around the world. But obviously a lot of us adults have been inspired that we actually must make change. And so it's not really the responsibility of just one person, it's the responsibility of all of us. And there is optimism, and I feel that there is optimism in city governments. And if anything, COVID has shown us that we can act at scale, we can act at speed, and we can integrate, which I think a lot of us have mentioned, that integration of policy and implementation is critical if we're going to achieve what we need to achieve. And I mean, it's interesting, we're talking 2021 is the year that we need to act, but we've been saying that since the 70s. Yeah. You know, in the Rio, at the Club of Rome, and then Rio in the 90s, and then Paris. And now, you know, we're coming up to COP26 and, you know, again, reflecting on Greta's book, and she was so angry that she stopped going to school. You know, so a lot of people are angry in Melbourne and they're stopping the cars. You know, is that the right thing or the wrong thing? But people are angry and they're just trying to make their point made.
Robyn, the cries finally no longer falling on deaf ears, or are we too far away, do you think, for things to really start changing this year?
I think things are moving in Australia now at last. Although Australia has been ranked in the bottom 5 in the Climate Change Performance Index every year since 2015 up until 2020 out of 60 countries. So that's a pretty bad reflection on Australia's national policy framework. That said, we have 4 states in Australia that have enacted flagship climate legislation with long-term and interim targets, taking advice from independent experts, with transparency and accountability and reporting systems. And they're all Labor states, but we also see a Liberal climate minister in New South Wales moving aggressively on renewable energy, and we're seeing that start to kick off also in Queensland and Western Australia. The big challenge in Australia is to phase out our coal fleet by 2030, which we have to do as a rich country. There's coal fleets all around the world, but we need to go ahead of developing countries given our wealth. We need to have a much more robust national framework to guide and to integrate what's happening at the subnational level. But at local government, Darebin City Council was the first climate emergency declaration in the world, and at subnational, we're starting to move. And this is really encouraging. And it's going to make our emissions profile better than they would have otherwise been. But of course, the federal government will try and claim some credit for that, which is not due to it. So we really do need to shift the goalposts at the national level.
Taking credit, I hear what you're saying. And Ross, actually, I want to go to you next. Action on climate is starting to become economically just the smart thing to do. Is that where we have to be in order to really get things moving? Or do you think that there are some other drivers that might be able to help us?
Well, it's the smart thing to do in the short term and the long term. It was always the economically smart thing to do for the long term. That was my climate change review a dozen years ago, which showed that the economic costs of not acting were much greater than the costs of acting. But there was a price to be paid in the early years, which we got back with big returns later on if we acted on climate change, acted strongly on climate change. What's changed over the last dozen years, and this was the theme of my book Superpower in 2019, was the costs of a lot of the zero emissions technologies have come down so much that in some countries, and Australia is one of those, it's actually an economic advantage to move more quickly. Robyn said we have to phase out the coal fleet by 2030, and we have a moral responsibility in the international community to do that because we're rich. Well, we'll be richer if we actually phase them out by 2030. You've got to be clever about it. You've got to put in place a good policy framework that brings on the other technologies, which firm power coming from solar and wind to make sure you've got power 24 hours a day. But those technologies are available if the policy framework is right. The absent ingredient at the moment is political will in our fractured polity, or at least our fractured polity at the Commonwealth level. The rest of the developed world and China and most of the developing world are properly focused on the importance of long-term and early action. Australia at the federal level hasn't yet got that focus. I'm expecting that realization that grasping the low carbon opportunity can be part of the achievement of full employment and rising incomes in Australia after the pandemic recession will help move us towards that international consensus.
You don't want to let a crisis go to waste, right? That's the call, I think, from a lot of corners. John, are you finding our Pacific partners, those smaller island nations, are taking advantage of where we are right now in order to use technology and the current public will to move things along?
I think COVID, you talked about COVID, was a really interesting event in the Pacific. And so 10 of the countries that didn't have a single case of COVID, 3 of those were the very small, remote, low-lying atoll countries in the Pacific, Tuvalu, Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. Now, assessments of global health vulnerability and assessments of climate change vulnerability prior to COVID-19 said these are the most vulnerable countries in the world. But they didn't have a single case. And it's a little bit like the story which was similar in Australia about how, given self-determination over their health response, Indigenous Australians were actually very effective in keeping COVID infections out of Indigenous communities. This is also the story in the Pacific. Faced with a significant threat, those countries reacted. They closed their borders. They've institutionalised all sorts of really interesting internal self-sufficiency measures during that time, people going out to rural areas and growing food, a reactivation of kinship networks to activate land, and all sorts of interesting things that are going on in those countries. And what it's, I think, really shown for anybody who pays attention is that, and we've been arguing, you don't do adaptation to these places, they do adaptation for themselves and we assist them. And this is exactly the lesson of COVID. The international community didn't have to help those countries, they helped themselves. And the role of the international community is to help them to get their way out of that COVID crisis. And so there's really important lessons there about about what can be achieved given a respect for self-determination, what can be achieved when those countries drive climate change responses for themselves. And that has to be a basis for renegotiating our relationship with them. It is very much, we assume you're vulnerable, we assume we have to help you, when the lesson has to be, no, they're actually incredibly resilient, they're full of good ideas, they're very capable of governing themselves, we have to support that and augment that capacity. And that I think has been a really critical turn in the last 12 months.
Resilience, not only for those islands, that's also in Australia a real fairly new focus, at least in the public discussion. Some might argue that the government has used that as a distraction. Kate, what do you think? Are we talking too much about being ready for the climate that we're going to have to put up with and not talking enough about reducing emissions?
I probably wouldn't say that, and in the specific case of Australia, we're just not talking enough about climate at all. But resilience is a really interesting term, and in terms of thinking about about COVID and the coronavirus, it's from my perspective, it highlights again how all the crises we're facing, the climate, coronavirus, economic crisis that's caused, are all linked, and they all come back to the biodiversity crisis. So it's obviously this is a zoonotic disease that's transferred from animals to humans, and it's assumed that this is because we're pushing further into wild areas. Deforestation is still rampant globally, and this increases disease transfer. But what we also need to realise, and what research is showing more as people focus on this, is it's not just that we're clearing land areas and coming more into contact with wildlife, it's actually the degradation of biodiversity that increases those diseases and the disease transfer to humans. So as there's less diversity, as there's fewer species populations in forested areas, viruses multiply more, they increase, and they'll transfer to humans more. So resilience, biodiversity is about resilience, and resilience of diverse natural ecosystems will also help resilience of human health as well.
Robyn, I want to talk to you about the state that we're at with the US now. I couldn't believe it this morning. I heard on the news that Donald Trump has announced he's going to launch his own social media platform in an era of fake news and all of the wild things that have been happening in global politics. Do we really have a hope?
Well, Trump is no longer in the White House. We need to hang on to that good thought, right? And Joe Biden is, and as I said earlier, he's approaching climate change very aggressively. Even before he was elected, he had promised to kick in $2 trillion or to generate $2 trillion of investment to create a carbon-free electricity in the US by 2035. He's got the military working on it. He's setting up an army corps. He's got a strong environmental justice component. So he's moving aggressively. Of course, he's having to do a lot of this with executive orders rather than legislation because the Democrats don't control the Senate. And therein is the problem, and this gets back to the polarization problem. And this is a major problem around the world. And bipartisanship is a rare thing in America and becoming increasingly rare in Australia as well. And it's no accident that climate denialism is strongest in the Anglosphere. And one of the reasons for that is the nature of the press and social media, partly, but certainly the Murdoch press has quite a foothold in the Anglosphere. So these are not disconnected. We should be really worried about our own media landscape if we want intelligent conversations about climate change and adaptation, and also intervention, technological intervention to address the problem, like geoengineering. That's the third leg of climate change, and it's a really serious issue that needs careful debate. And so with a distorted media, a very distorted media playing field, we need to think of other ways of, what's happening at the moment with our landscape I find really disturbing. I don't have the answers to that, so I'm very worried, I guess, is the end point. But looking for innovative ways to further diversify our communication systems and ways in which can include fact-checking, respect different worldviews and lived experiences and local knowledges and, of course, Indigenous knowledge, but in a way where it's feeding into a conversation rather than separating us, bringing us together to enhance mutual understanding. That would be my desire. I'm not quite sure how to engineer that, though.
Yeah, engineering, you've mentioned a couple of things there, coming together and also geoengineering our way out of this problem is something that we are likely going to have to do. And Kathy, I want to know, when it comes to cities, how come cities are so much better at doing stuff than these bigger political organisations, especially when, like you're saying, the Anglosphere is so riddled with climate denialism? Why are our cities not being affected by that in the same way?
Well, I was going to say to some degree we are, because I mean that's one of the positives of COVID was that cities were able to accelerate some of these actions that they've been testing and trialling and innovating on at the smaller scale. You know, the 40-kilometre rollout of separated bike lanes, that would have, you know, certainly been in the media, and maybe the cities would have been more risk adverse. And we saw that across the world, you know, bike lanes being rolled out at a pace that wouldn't necessarily have been possible in the usual business. Likewise, you know, biodiversity planting and tree planting, you know. Everyone loves a tree, but not all the same tree. And so again, you have a lot of, you know, conflict about what to roll out. But certainly cities have really excellent relationships with universities. And in Melbourne in particular, there's been some excellent work between the University of Melbourne and the City of Melbourne in climate research that's relevant to cities. And that's what we need a lot more of. We need really city-scale data and city-scale information. But we've got some great examples in Melbourne and cities all around the world of using data really usefully to make some, you know, innovative changes. The trick is, how do we scale it up? And cities are so contextually different. It is often hard to scale up the innovation that we see in these test beds that are cities, but we're seeing a lot more of that acceleration. And that's why when we're looking at the nationally determined commitments, as we've spoken about before, as national governments are looking to what they're going to do to accelerate their climate ambition, they really do need to look at cities where they've tested these ideas, where they've trialled these ideas, where they've, you know, looked at adaptation and resilience and mitigation, not just a single focus. So.
Yeah, Ross, how does it stack up economically when you're talking about scaling up and geoengineering? Do we still, is there still a future that you know is livable in terms of like the way the world works, or do we need to have some re-innovation in the world of economics too?
Well, it depends a bit what you mean by geoengineering, Nate. But if you're meaning
take your pick.
If you're meaning what the geoengineers seem to mean, putting particles in using spaceships to put particles in the stratosphere to block out some of the sun's rays, that could have unintended consequences. It may create a catastrophe in the acidification of the oceans by letting carbon dioxide build up without warming. You'd still get the acidification of the oceans, and that would have its own huge effects. I think that we can solve the problem with further development, further reductions in costs of technologies that we already know. In nearly all areas, we can see a path using technologies we understand and which don't have these very risky dimensions to get to zero emissions. There's a very large opportunity in sequestering carbon in the landscape, but let's use that to bring forward the date of zero net emissions, not to go slower on the other things. The technologies are already there. Some of them will give us lower costs and economic advantage in the world as a whole, much bigger advantage in Australia with our rich renewable energy resources. So I don't think we have to throw a Hail Mary into the stratosphere to solve this problem.
All right, so there are economic solutions if we develop some of the tools and technologies we already have. And there are other benefits as well, aren't there, Kate, from using things like reforestation potentially when it comes to our biodiversity as well. Do you think that when we try to undo the damage we've done, do you think we'll be able to actually fix things, get back to where we were once upon a time, or has Earth forever changed?
Well, we have to get as far back as we can towards a more biodiverse planet. We've lost more than half of natural lands on the planet, and we need to think of this in the concept of biospheric integrity, which is sort of speaking to the idea that we need planetary boundaries that can support life on this planet. And we're already crossing those planetary boundaries in several areas. So it's not really a case of will we get back to a healthy, functioning biosphere, but that we must. And so the goals being talked about under the Convention on Biodiversity are quite bold in terms of protecting 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030, and half of the world protected, half of the earth and oceans protected as biodiverse ecosystems by 2050. But it's really important to remember within that, and it's a bit what John spoke to, that doesn't mean that people don't live in those areas. It's actually people living in self-determination and able to create their own adaptation and resilience that also protects landscapes around them. So it's a real people and planet both need to be able to flourish.
Yeah, because if we lose our biodiversity, John, there's so many. Like I turn again, it's your area of expertise as well, but to our partners in the Pacific, so many places that literally will be unable to do what a larger country like Australia can do in terms of importing and purchasing things from other places. What's the concern when it comes to climate refugees for our Pacific partner nations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fairly long conversation. Look, I think it's a massively overdetermined conversation, basically. I mean, there's a number of elements to this that sort of need to be unpacked. Partly, frankly, we're flattering ourselves when we say there's going to be climate refugees coming to Australia. There's lots of people in Papua New Guinea who come to Australia who don't. There's lots of people in the Pacific who could come to Australia who don't. We might understand why people from the Pacific who are able to leave mostly choose not to come to Australia, and that I just point to our relationship with our Indigenous people to give you some clues as to why people in the Pacific might not choose to come here. Secondly, people who might choose or have the opportunity to leave due to climate change, we might look at the floods in Australia right now or look at our bushfires and conclude that they might be a bit smarter than us and realise Australia ain't going to be a great place to live under climate change either, and given a choice between living in somebody else's country without access to property and decision making and dealing with climate change or living in my own, I'd rather live in my own country. My ancestors have known how to deal with these problems for 3,000 years. I'll take my chances. So I think we're kind of focusing on the wrong sorts of questions here. The issue really is the people who cannot leave and the people who have a right to remain. How can we make sure that they have an ability to live a dignified life in those islands? And that's got to be really, that's the only moral kind of question we should be asking ourselves. How can we enable those people to live on those islands? And it does link to Kate's question about biodiversity. We know that the islands that are responding best to current patterns of sea level rise are those that are the least modified, the shorelines are least modified and the reefs are most healthy. So that working with biodiversity and working with good ecosystems does seem to be the key to adapting to climate change in those regions. And you know, this has got to be the issue. The refugees conversation is a really big red herring, basically, and it's shot full, frankly, of some quite questionable assumptions about ourselves and other people in the world.
Robyn, are we hearing the voices from those smaller nations enough on a global stage?
The short answer is no, although it should be said that the Foreign Minister of the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruyn, led the High Ambition Coalition. They emerged from the shadows midway through the 2-week negotiation, and they got the US on side, then the EU, and eventually everyone, pretty much, to include 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement, which I think was a real coup. And that was through the sheer moral force of their argument. And this raises the broader issues of climate justice. It's got so many dimensions to it. John's been speaking eloquently about it in the Pacific, but of course he knows more than many that those who suffer the worst effects are those that contribute the least and usually have the least adaptive capacity. So acknowledging those injustices, I think, is really, really important and needs to totally infuse climate policy at every level, not just transition for communities and workers in coal communities, but climate policy across the board should think about its distributive consequences. So we have hard decisions. How do we deal with countries, developing countries, quite poor countries, that have a strong dependence on fossil fuels? The Paris Agreement and all the treaties before it, the Kyoto Agreement, Kyoto Protocol and the Framework Convention back in 1992 mentioned fossil fuels only twice, and that's to protect countries dependent on fossil fuels from the adverse effect of climate policies by others. So that was the elephant in the room. And we don't have a mechanism for an equitable phase out of fossil fuels around the world. And once we crack that nut, things will really start to move quickly. Rich countries were supposed to mobilise $100 billion US dollars annually by 2020. They didn't make that mark. So one of the things on the agenda in Glasgow is to work towards start new talks to come up with a higher goal by 2025. And most of this money goes to the Green Climate Fund, and that goes to developing countries for mitigation and adaptation so as not to kick the ladder down. That's the point. So this is a problem when we talk about carbon tariffs, because we've heard about the EU wanting to put a carbon tariff on imports, countries that are not doing their fair share in reducing emissions and basically free riding on the efforts of others. But if they do that uniformly to developing countries, it's kind of perverse because under the principles of common but differentiated responsibility, rich countries are supposed to go first, incur more costs, and assist developing countries to mitigate and adapt. And so coming up with a fair way of doing that for developing countries is going to be a tricky issue, but it needs to be addressed.
Let's stay on cost, because there is no such thing as a free lunch. I mean, we know that's how we got here, right? Ross, what is action on climate change actually going to cost? There's a lot of fear about lost jobs and things like that, but from an economist's point of view, what is the real cost for us?
That's a very different answer to what I would have given, what I did give on the same question a dozen years ago. We measured the cost then through elaborate modelling. It was going to cost us a couple of percent of GDP to get emissions down by, we were then talking about 90% by mid-century. And then we would get that back with a high rate of return in subsequent years. So if you take a long-term view, it was negative cost even then. It only has a positive cost if you only think about yourself, about your own generation and not subsequent generations. I must say that the question of intergenerational equity is one that we're not used to thinking about. And one of the big bits of progress in the last dozen years has been advances in our thinking about the ethics of climate change. Many big contributions on that, probably the biggest, Pope Francis and Laudato Si, where action on climate was seen as a social justice issue, as well as an issue with other ethical dimensions. But even in Australia, with very large opportunities for incomes growth from using well our zero emissions opportunity, there will be distributional consequences. There will be workers who now have good jobs, regions that have reasonable levels of prosperity based on fossil fuels. And so there's a distributional question to deal with, not different in kind to distributional questions we've dealt with in other contexts. When tariffs were removed in the late 80s and 90s, special programs were developed for workers in the textiles industries, the steel industry, and these reduce the costs of adjustment for communities and individuals most affected. We did it reasonably well. We could do it better than we did then. That needs to be a big focus now. So the economic costs are economic costs to some people and some communities. Overall, we'll be damaged economically more if we don't act promptly than if we do.
When we talk about the cost as well, and people losing jobs, that sort of thing potentially, we are talking about a gap, right? Some like a difference between the richest and the poorest, or those that manage to get into the industries that would be protected in a world where we are fixing the climate versus not. Cities deal with disparity quite a lot. Cathy, what do we need to do in order to make sure that we're bringing everyone along with us as we try to fix this stuff up that we've made globally?
Well, I've said it previously, data and evidence is really important to making those decisions. And again, going back to what we witnessed in COVID, and again, looking at some of our extraordinary colleagues at the University of Melbourne in the way that they brought really different perspectives to the modelling that was used to make decisions around COVID, where it wasn't just about one piece of data, it was about looking at how people are moving and how people are living and how people might react or be impacted. I think that that's the sort of scale of information and data that we need to make much more equitable and just decisions. And again, thinking about the last 12 months, we really saw the importance of our environment to how people's health and well-being is impacted, and whether that's clean air in our cities or access to green and open space. That's important, but also how we heat and cool our homes, because that's where we were all confined for so long. So again, I think it brought to the forefront the need to make much better and much more equitable decisions, and we saw that we could do it. I mean, that was the other thing, that we saw that we could make decisions that brought much more access to housing and access to funds to the most vulnerable. So the decisions can be made using the data that is available. What we need to be doing is holding on to that and keeping going rather than going back. I mean, I'd be interested in, even though you're doing the questions, but interested in Ross's, perspectives, because, I saw a lot of really great enthusiasm around things like the donut economic model and different approaches to how we make decisions in cities, that it's not just a linear, it's actually taking in the considerations of the economy, the ecology, the social justice, in all of the decisions that you're making. And some cities have shown around the world, and again, some in Australia, but certainly a lot of South American cities have shown, participatory budgeting and, including the citizens in the decisions that are being made is one way to get much more equitable and much more just decisions. So including people in the decisions, but with the right amount of information and data is really key.
I'm going to cede the floor. Would you like to ask Ross a question directly?
Through the camera? Oh no, not to. Well, I'd be interested in his perspective on how do we not go back to business as usual? How do we actually grasp a hold of new thinking like the donut economics and the models that are being progressed and vocalised and seen in cities like Amsterdam as a new way to operate?
I'm taking back the floor. Ross, Cathy's question, please. Your thoughts.
Yeah, well, we do have to be very careful not to go back to what we had before. Well, 2013 to 2019 were pretty awful years for the general run of Australians. I call them the dog days. We were the worst performing economy in the developed world in terms of growth in output per person, and there was no growth at all in real average household income per person. Unemployment was stagnant when in other developed countries it fell quite a lot. Underemployment, people being classed by the statistician as having a job because they worked an hour last week, not being able to work the number of hours they wanted. So economically, we can't go back to the dog days. On climate policy, we can't go back to the dog days. Snap back to what we had before the pandemic, and conditions will be much worse through the 2020s for a number of reasons. One of them is that the accumulating effects of climate change will do more and more damage as time goes on. How do we get a focus on the need for change? A lot of the important ideas have been well worked through. A lot of them are very old ideas that have been blocked by vested interests and problems of our political system in recent times. In my book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession, that's just come out, I put the main focus on knowledge, on rebuilding the respect for knowledge in our political system, our policy-making processes. Australian democracy and indeed the notion of Australia are products of the Enlightenment. Respect for knowledge was at the centre of that. Those Enlightenment values have been corroded in recent times. There's a miserable future ahead for our democracy and our prosperity unless we restore respect for knowledge. I think that public discussion of the issues, discussion like this, in which we share ideas, build a broad base of community support for doing things in ways that give us good results for the community as a whole, is an essential prerequisite to good policy. And we still have a democracy, and in a democracy, the responsibility is ours. We've got to keep the discussion alive. We've got to build the discussion to the point where ignorance is a political disadvantage for those who cling to it.
I absolutely agree, and that makes a perfect segue. Now that I've given up the floor once, let's hand it over to some questions from our audience. During 2020, nation-states like Australia showed the power of collective decision-making. What does the panel think the role is for local government in this? Should they be represented in forums such as National Cabinet? How else can cities be at the table? Kate.
It sounds really like a question for Kathy, I'd have to say.
Kathy.
You know what? Well, I'm biased, so I actually be interested to see if everyone agrees with me. But well, yeah, sure. The answer is yes. I think what does that mean is the important question. I think we saw, in the Paris Agreement, cities or local and subnational governments were recognised, but unless that's translated into action, what does it actually mean? So even though it was like the Olympic moment when, cities or local and subnational governments were put in the text, and that took months and years of negotiation with all of the nations just to get a couple of words. It is quite significant, but it doesn't mean anything unless something happens, and that is that integrated decisions around policy and technology and social innovations as well. But it is really important that they're recognised and included.
Let's move overseas, and Robyn, this will, I think, probably be right up your alley. With respect to China's policies, what does the panel, and Robyn, we'll start with you, what do you think of the fact that China is still planning or is actually building dozens of coal-fired power stations?
That's a great question, and my answer is I'm deeply worried by that. Since Paris, China's gone rather quiet. There was great talk that China would fill the vacuum created by the abdication of leadership by the new President Trump. That didn't really happen. It played a more defensive role. Its 5-year plan to 2025 is rather underwhelming, and although it's closed down a large number of old coal plants, it's busily meeting more. And China is also the biggest financier of the construction of coal-fired power plants around the world as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. And although there's some talk about greening that, it's very selective. So it's deeply troubling that despite Xi Jinping's plan of China developing into an ecological civilization, and this is a plan for China, not the world, China doesn't see its role as leading the world in the way that the US does, whether it's been invited to or not. China sees itself as the official head of the G77, but there's a huge split in the G77. it's no longer 77 countries, it's many more developing countries, a split between the least developed and particularly, and the major emerging economies. And China has increasingly hid behind its paw in international negotiations and ignored the fact that it has more rich middle-class consumers than most OECD countries, taken individually. So China is contradictory, and you see that within its agencies, right? Not unlike in OECD countries. However, face is very important to China. So if it says it's got a target, like it's going to be carbon neutral by 2060, it will. Its Paris pledge for 2015 is for its emissions to peak no later than 2030. But at the moment, China's emissions will have to fall off a cliff in 2029 because it's not really shaping up to be aggressive in its overall plan. But its commitment to coal is deeply worrying. And how to deal with that diplomatically is going to be very difficult. And I'd be very interested to see how John Kerry approaches that. But there's the Powering Past Coal Alliance in the world, which is one of these growing number of coalitions of the willing, but most of the members don't have a big dependence on coal. So phasing out fossil fuel trade, phasing out coal in particular is, I think, the really hard nut to crack. The obvious thing is to start with phasing out subsidies to fossil fuels. That's been on the G20 agenda for a long time with very little action. Momentum for that has to be renewed. That's the first thing you do. And then you start a phase out where rich countries go first and you provide ways for developing countries to do it a little more slowly with assistance to move into other energy systems. That seems the obvious fair way for a plan, but we need big movers and shakers to push that, not just academics and friendly coalitions of the willing for whom it's not a great cost for them.
Yeah, when we're dealing with really big problems, you're right, big movers and shakers. And speaking of big problems, this last year we've seen some extremes, certainly in weather. I have a question here, given the bushfires. I mean, right now, a big chunk of Australia is underwater as we speak, in flooding that's happening in the eastern states. Is there a role for nature-based climate solutions in responding to and adapting to these sorts of extreme events? John?
Yeah, I think so. I'll be speaking somewhat off topic if I talk about Australia, but it's really clear in small islands that there is a huge role. And so if you think about, in the coast, there's been a lot of innovation on nature-based solutions around the world that's showing quite positive effects in terms of attenuating coastal erosion, increasing biodiversity, and also in many ways increasing people's livelihoods. Oyster reefs are the kind of classic example of that. There's less application of those into tropical reef-facing coasts, but we think, and at the University of Melbourne, talking actually right now with colleagues in the National Centre for Climate Coasts and elsewhere, that there's a lot of scope for actually trial and experimenting nature-based solutions that sort of augment those capabilities that I was talking about before. But you could think about the possibility about, growing giant clam beds, using a combination of kind of modern and traditional ecological things that are producing sediment or attenuating currents, as well as creating livelihoods for people. There's a lot of science that needs to go into that, and it really will require the best kind of combinations of environmental engineering and kind of traditional knowledge as well as customary practices. But it's actually really exciting, and I think it's a huge way forward actually for driving adaptation in rural islands in the Pacific. Especially, and that's one of the things I'm really optimistic about and really excited about, and it's a really huge role for all sorts of the sort of sciences in the academy as well. It can have a really positive impact in lots of great ways. So yeah.
Talking about across the university, Kate, this is in your wheelhouse as well.
Obviously there's lots of benefits and potentials for natural climate solutions to support adaptation, as well as they're also helping to mitigate against climate change. I think a really good example in Australia is that more intact biodiverse native forests are less susceptible to bushfires, more resilient to drought, and also would help more with flood retention and that sort of thing. So the more intact forests we have, we reduce severity of fires.
Yeah, and we also do a whole bunch of extra things, right? Like sequestering more carbon, making the planet more just like it was once upon a time, and people can get out in nature and do things that aren't just good and focused on climate change, but also are just nice, which is great. I have one final question. We'll keep it pretty tight. John, this is back to you. I know we've already touched on this, but what are the most important things Australia and the international community can do to assist small island states to live with and adapt to climate change? That's the question. I guess from what you said earlier, mostly it's stand back and offer the assistance that's asked for. There is a second part to the question that maybe we'll focus on more. What can we learn from what they are doing?
That's an excellent question. And that's a really great question. So I think, give me 60 seconds. The problem with adaptation in this country is that there is it's incredibly politically risky. So go for a walk down to the city of Port Phillip and think about what 50 centimetres of sea level rise might do and what we're going to do about the city of Port Phillip. Are we going to build seawalls? Who's going to pay for them? Are we going to think about managed alignment or accommodation? Think about the huge capital cost of that and then say, I'm the mayor of the city of Port Phillip or I'm the Premier of Victoria and I'm going to announce some sort of strategic adaptation plan for the city of Port Phillip. You're not going to do it. You're on a hiding to nothing. There's no public mandate for that. So there's something about the sort of salience of the problem there, and we'll just push this into the long grass for the next government, the next government, the next government, until there's a huge catastrophic event and there'll be no insurance payouts and it'll be too late, right? The thing that you really see having worked in Australia and then going to the smaller states is the really, really hard conversations, the absolute honest facing of these problems, because it's absolutely critical they realise that the decisions they make now in the next 5 years are going to really matter. So they're having really hard decisions about re-engineering their capitals, who are we going to get international assistance from to do this, what are the acceptable technologies, what are the acceptable environmental costs, what are the human rights implications of the really strategic long-term spatial and demographic and environmental planning decisions we're going to have to make. And they are brutally honest, and you listen to these conversations and you hear what the political leaders are saying and what they're talking about on the streets about their kind of futures, and you come back to Australia where there's absolutely no conversation whatsoever. So what we can learn from them is courage and honesty and leadership.
Courage, honesty and leadership. Okay, I'm going to, in fact, infuse all of you with that right now. You've got a speaking slot at COP26. Glasgow, November. You get to have one thing you want to leave them with. Ross, I know you actually do need to leave us shortly. Let's start with you. What is the message you are leaving in Glasgow?
That we can do it, that all of the developed countries in the world except Australia and plus the world's biggest developing country, China, are committing to do it. The technologies are there. The costs of failing to act are much greater than the costs of acting. So let's use this near consensus, first of all, to get the laggard on board, get Australia on board, and then let's do it.
Robyn, you have the unenviable task of following Ross at Glasgow. Your final words.
I would just repeat, absolutely all hands on deck, and ask everyone to imagine you're speaking to your great-great-grandchildren. Tell them now what you're going to do, and we're going to record this and play it back to them. It just might sober folk up, particularly world leaders. Maybe that one.
Brilliant. All right, and let's come back into the room. Kathy.
60 seconds only? No. Well, the science is clear. We've got to stop talking and we have to act, echoing what my fellow speakers have just said. But, when it comes to cities, national governments not only need to work with them on policy, but also invest in science and research that city leaders want to make the right decisions and need to make the right decisions.
Okay, John, what are you telling Glasgow in November?
I think there's lots of opportunities in climate change action in both mitigation and adaptation. They should fully commit to capitalising those opportunities, and I would argue there's a very strong moral argument to do so. Every country in the world has signed the Convention on Human Rights. If they're serious about that, they have to reduce emissions and support the most vulnerable to adapt.
And Kate, you are the very final speaker at COP26. But the floor is yours. Take as much time as you'd like. What are you? Yeah, I'll stop if we go into December. Tell me, what is it that you're telling me?
Well, one of the reasons Glasgow is such a critical summit is countries are supposed to provide updated ambition in their climate goals for 2025 and 2030. And so what I would say, central to these climate negotiations is the concept of equity, as Robyn has mentioned. So these updated climate goals need to be equitable. And that sounds sort of technical, like it doesn't mean anything, but it actually means everything, because if countries grapple with this in an honest, courageous way, as John was talking about, putting forward climate goals that are actually fair means acknowledging that many countries, Australia included, the US, the EU, we've all exceeded our carbon budgets, our fair share of global carbon emissions. And so our climate targets need to not only reduce emissions as fast as we can, but need to provide large amounts of finance, technology transfer, capacity support for the developing world to help them adapt and mitigate. And it's not until we really start to grapple with the concept of fairness and think about ethically based principles of what fairness really means in the climate context that we'll start to think about climate targets that are adequate to the scale of the challenge ahead. So that's what I would tell Glasgow.
Yeah, very, very nicely done. Equity has to be held central as we move towards fixing the problem that we've largely created. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we'd love you to stick around. Thank you for joining us as well. Next session is going to be at 11 o'clock this morning in an equally diverse panel discussing the challenges we face and building resilience. It's going to be hosted by Jo Chandler from the Centre of Advancing Journalism. Melbourne Climate Futures is a new initiative from the University of Melbourne. Now, this discussion is one of 4 sessions being held today. If you want to find the others, they will be available on the University of Melbourne's YouTube channel. For more information on the initiative and upcoming events, visit us at research.unimelb.edu.au. We also have a great piece on the university's news channel, Pursuit. You should definitely check it out, and you can read it at pursuit.unimelb.edu.au. Once again, to all of my panellists, thank you so much for joining us here this morning for this very robust discussion. I feel like with people like you at the helm, we're probably in some of the safest hands we could possibly be in. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.